All right, everyone, it's time for the fallout from the Alabama election because, of course, this is really what everyone's talking about today. It's rather funny, like literally hysterical to see the result because remember, like a couple hours before it was kind of clear who had won, Roy Moore was up by like 5 points, and there were a lot of people like on my Twitter saying, "Oh, Jones has no chance. Roy Moore, he's going to win by 10 points. He's going to win by 15 points." And I'm sitting there, I'm chuckling to myself because, number one, it was clear that it wasn't going to be that big a gap. He would have to rely upon literally one outlier poll out of a dozen polls to imagine such a scenario. It'd be like if Jones had won by, 7, 8 points. It would be one poll out of a fucking dozen fairly recent polls. That was never going to happen. Number two, of course, and the New York Times was fixated on this differential turnout, and that's really what caused this effect. But that's just a symptom. The real disease is the RNC itself. I hate to say this, but the Republicans, as long as Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell and Reince Priebus and people like that are in positions of power within the organizational and fundraising structure of the Republican Party, you might actually have problems in the midterms. Now, I don't expect that. Keep this in mind. The Democrats here, we got to go through a sort of a list of takeaways from this election. Number one, the GOP right now has become weak, specifically because of the RNC's poor leadership. They can't even hold on to a Senate seat in Alabama. I hate to tell the partisans or even the Trumpite, actual right wing here. Now, I can say this because I'm not a Republican. I'm not a conservative. I don't fucking give a damn. I'm going to tell you this, you need to lean on the RNC. Even though little people lay Republicans, you need to do the same thing. Otherwise, you're going to probably lose in the midterms. I know you don't want to hear that. You want to hear, oh, well, it was vote rigging, it was voter fraud, it was felons or dead people voting, or, it was the result of media smear. Well, it doesn't really matter what caused it. The Democrats just won a race in Alabama. Keep that in mind. It doesn't show positive movement in the right direction for the GOP. Not that it really matters because, of course, half of these people are basically Democrats with an R after their name as much as half the Democrats are Republicans with a D after their name. We got to keep in mind the false dichotomy of the two-party system. The other takeaway, the next one, is the Democrats actually look weak too. Look, they spent months declaring that Roy Moore was beyond all possible human redemption. A rapist, probably a pedophile, an anti-Semite, didn't know what he was doing, all sorts of hyper-religious and ignorant. They cast him off as being essentially Satan incarnate, and they barely managed to make ends meet, and they barely did that even though they outspent him on advertising multiple times over, and while he was abandoned by large segments of his own party. In order for the Democrats to win this seat, their opponent had to be basically completely debased even by his own political movement. That doesn't show strength. The big thing of the day, I'm looking on Being Liberal, MSNBC and stuff, they're all crowing about black female voters. It is true that higher turnout in urban areas, especially among the black voting population in Alabama, tipped it in favor of Jones, but that wouldn't have happened if Moore's voters had shown turnout that was even somewhat higher. Turnout for Roy Moore was extremely low. That's the other side of the story, and that has nothing to do with Democratic voters being energized. It has to do with the fact that a lot of Republican voters, I think, stayed home because people within their own party told them not to vote for Roy Moore. Had that not happened, if the Republicans had not tried to play the social justice warriors game, I think what happened, I think they were expecting that Moore would collapse. Like he did temporarily, because this was a close race. So there was a time it looked like he was 10 points behind, or maybe even more. I think that Paul Ryan and Priebus and all these others expected that Roy Moore could never recover the lost ground from the allegations. Therefore, they thought it would be political suicide for the party to officially back him. The RNC withdraws from the fray. A lot of the Republicans, like Mitt Romney, comes out. Phil Scott, governor of this state, he comes out and says, oh, I wouldn't vote for him. Basically, we can't defend this. Sexual assault is a, big, serious thing. Now, it's just allegations. There's no actual evidence of wrongdoing. And, of course, a week before the race ends, they find out one of the key pieces of evidence was forged anyway. It completely destroys the entire argument, but it was too little too late. Trump shows up, does a robocall, too little too late. Bannon shows up, too little too late. Then the RNC, right now they're sweating. because they realize that Trump might very well come out in a pissy rage and say, hey, Roy Moore would have won, but, you know, all these other Republicans abandoned him. I stood by him. Don't blame me, not my fault. Now they're trying to deflect off on Steve Bannon, of all people. Oh, he showed up and campaigned for Roy Moore. That's why he lost. No, it's not. It's a combination of multiple things. The effects that caused it directly: higher turnout for the Democrats, lower turnout for the Republicans. It's literally that simple. But what caused that? On the Democratic side, it's mostly the news media whipped up the Democrats into a frenzy, but the turnout for the Democrats here wasn't that much higher than it was in the last election. It was hovering close to 2008 levels. It's higher than normal, but it's not spectacular. It's certainly not anything to write home about. It was just enough to tip the election towards them, which makes the GOP look totally fucking foolish. But it also relied upon lower turnout for the Republicans. We have to ask ourselves then, why did they have lower turnout? And I think that's quite clear. I think it's the RNC's fault. It has nothing to do with Steve. How is Steve Bannon showing up going to lower turnout for Roy Moore? If anything, among the further right reaches of the state, that would energize them more. Trump's robocall, same thing. And you've got to understand as well, Trump originally endorsed Roy Moore's opponent. So he's got plausible deniability. He can come and say, hey, you know, I told the Republican Party that he wasn't the right man for the job. I did my job, closed ranks, and kept supporting him, and didn't do what the RNC did and fled the battlefield and basically acted like a shit towards the Republican candidate over mere allegations. But I originally didn't even support Roy Moore. I thought that the other dude was the right man for the job. Haha, look, I was right. Once again, Trump won, RNC 0. He can attack the Republican Party, and he's got a proclivity towards doing that even on the best of days. Might get to see some interesting tweets over this. By the way, if I were advising Trump, I would tell him he should probably do that. Limit the attack, though. Attack just the party leadership, like Paul Ryan and Reince Priebus, and say, you know, talk down to him a little. Say, you know, I respect him, I'm kind of friendly with him, but, you know, you made a mistake. You gotta own up to it. Don't fucking try to blame me. Don't fucking try to blame Bannon. Own up to your mistakes and reform the party. Kick out some of these weak, ineffectual losers, he has to use the loser term, and get someone new in there. Oddly enough, if he were to go on the attack and say something like that, it'd be 100% right. But then I also thought, I was thinking to myself, it was kind of funny, because you'll remember over the last week, as Roy Moore recovered and it looked more like he had an advantage, and this is what I was counting on, honestly. I didn't think that the turnout differential would be quite enough to tip it. I knew it was going to be razor thin and close. I didn't expect Roy Moore to, like, run away with the race, but I expected he would manage to barely hold it, which, by the way, that wouldn't have been any better for the Republicans. Okay, they hold the Senate seat, they still look weak. Then the news of the day from the Democrats would be, oh, Republicans barely hold seat in deep red Alabama. And that would be correct. It wouldn't even be a smear piece to point that out. The Republicans have to feel really bad about themselves. And that includes people who actually campaigned for Roy Moore. You failed. Trump, fundamentally, he did too little too. The only thing he's culpable for is, hey, he comes out at the very end, makes a robocall, but says ultimately very little beforehand. But I was thinking, you'll remember that as it looked more like Moore was going to carry the race, you know, after he recovers from the sex abuse allegations, a lot of the Democrats, if you looked on Being Liberal or MSNBC's comment areas or something like that, they were like, oh, but they're still Alabama rubes. They're ignorant. Of course Roy Moore will win because these people are like ignorant, religious, and they have one tooth. It was very, very telling to see how many lay liberals, so-called, you know, these are the neoliberals. The social justice warriors hate you too, but for different reasons. The neoliberals just think of you as backwards, because you don't live in New York City or Los Angeles or something, or San Francisco. You don't live in a big city, you live in a small town and voted Roy Moore. These people think that you're like, you know, sub-middle school educated. I hope that some of you people realize this in the wake of the election result. They actually still do hate you, despite the fact that Doug Jones was elected. Look, story of the day again. Oh, black voters gave us Doug Jones and stopped Roy Moore. Where's the credit for any white voters that sat it out because they actually thought Roy Moore was guilty? You know, they're actually Republicans that sat it out. You're never going to get credit. You know, you can debase yourselves and insult yourselves all day. You say, oh yeah, we are kind of hillbilly-ish. We're sorry. Yeah, there are a lot of ignorant people in our culture, in our state's community. They're never going to let it go. They'll just double down on abusing you. Do realize that. You gotta understand. because they're elitists. They hate you. They think that you're what's wrong with the country. It's sort of like if someone's a wine-swilling urbanite, upper middle classer, they're never going to hear the end of it from small town America. They're not going to like, just because you show up and buy an RV and say, hey, I'm roughing it, I've only got a propane generator now, and you buy, your like 20-room log cabin ripoff. That doesn't make you a rural bumpkin, or it doesn't blend you in with the community, really. There are people who try to do this. Trust me. Oh, trust me, I saw plenty of them in the Queechee area. I saw plenty of them over there where people build McMansions, and they have like a four-wheeler, and they wear flannel shirts, and they pretend that they've always been rural. Some of these people, they're from fucking Bermuda or something. There's some CEO, they made like $10 million. They get a McMansion in the middle of rural Vermont. They think that they're roughing it. It's the funniest thing I've ever seen in my life. But the Republicans need to do more. Mainly, they need to kick out the RNC's leadership. They should have done that, though, long ago. They should have done that as soon as it became clear that they were going to oppose their own presidential candidate on a regular basis. They almost did to Trump what the RNC did to Roy Moore just now. They almost did. Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote. It's almost the same thing. Urban areas, higher than normal turnout, but in the case of the national election for the presidency, you have the Electoral College to go through. So having those extra votes in states that were already blue doesn't really matter as much. Meanwhile, in Alabama, of course, it's a different story. You're not dealing with the Electoral College. You're simply dealing with a popular vote. And of course, that's what tips it in favor of the Democrats here. Also, don't be surprised if Jones is a single-termer. Yeah, don't be surprised if he's not reelected. You got to realize it's going to bother, I think, the sort of Roy Moore voting base. The people that sat it out for Moore, if they get a candidate that's not embroiled in a sex scandal, they're going to vote for them. So this is a one-off. It also doesn't give the Democrats the Senate, and they're still at a loss. They're still probably going to lose several Senate seats in the midterms. That still remains my prediction, regardless of this, because I think that their ability to capitalize upon higher turnout based on people being worried about bigotry or Nazis, Russia, whatever it happens, sex assault, I don't think that translates to the national level. The problem is this was a platform-free candidacy for the Democrats. Doug Jones essentially just sat there, didn't even say much. Like, you heard very little about Doug Jones in the national debate. Maybe on the Alabama news you heard more about what he believed in. Everyone else just saw, hey, Roy Moore is a pedophile, Roy Moore is a rapist, Roy Moore, is creepy, Roy Moore did this, Roy Moore is anti-Semitic, Roy Moore thinks we should bring back slavery. Every single day for months, that's all we saw about Roy Moore. And with the internet, that trickles down to the Alabama voting results and demoralizes Moore's voters. Probably pisses some of them off and evens out because some of them vote more. But that sort of platform-free style of campaign isn't going to work when you're trying to manage a dozen races at the same time. The fact is that the DNC was able to flood money into the campaign. They had like Soros and Obama involvement, a lot of national resources going in. The DNC still has fundraising problems, and it has to defend an inordinate number of vulnerable Senate seats in states that went for Trump. That's a little bit of a different story. Now, this could be a bellwether that they do better than some people expected them to. They hold more of those seats. Does it give them the Senate, though? It's a very remote chance, especially when you got to think most of those candidates that'll be challenging the Democrats won't have a sex scandal. The DNC will not be able to single-mindedly focus on them. When you've got one race, it's a lot easier to browbeat it into the ground on a moralist basis. When you've got dozens of races, though, the national conversation can only absorb so much at one time. You'd have to rotate between attacking different candidates and smearing them and defaming them. That's hard to do because a week later people forget all about it and they rise back up. We saw this with Billy Bush. We saw this with the allegations against Moore himself. It just he didn't rise up enough. His turnout was depressed. So again, the takeaway is Republicans are weak enough to lose a seat in Alabama. Trust me. Like, if you're on the right, you can't be happy about that. You can't possibly think that this was a good outcome. You can spin it all you want, say, well, there's cheating, rigging, whatever. That's all sour grapes. It's like the Democrats blaming Russia or sexism or evil white men, whatever they're blaming after the last election. It's sour grapes. And the fact that they haven't worked on developing a platform and addressing the issues that led them to lose that election, they're going to keep being losers. The Republicans now, it looks like some of them want to do the same thing. Instead of blaming the RNC, which is responsible, kicking these people out, and forming ranks and refusing to back down in the, in the face of defamation, they just decide to fold. Well, that's not a good strategy. What you could see, this would be really funny, is when 2020 comes around, both the Republicans and Democrats are so embattled, they've ripped themselves to shreds so much, third-party membership rises even further. Maybe third parties make up 25% of the electorate or something. That would please me. That would be hilarious. Be the best possible. I hope it happens. My hope in 2020, at the current metric, depending on who the Democratic candidate is, I would end up hoping that Trump was reelected just because it would cause so much chaos and so many salty tears from the Democrats, while myself not really caring ultimately and hoping that libertarian membership rises, if they can solve that whole sovereignty issue. Of course, the one thing I mainly disagree with them on, they think for some reason they've become social justice warriors when it comes to immigration. I don't know why, I'm not exactly sure. I think there are other issues that play better to the libertarian stratagem, but that's what they chose to focus on. They essentially wanted to outgreen the Greens. Not the greatest strategy. Could have been a lot better. They could have cracked double digits in every state. But that's a little bit of analysis of the Roy Moore stuff. And also, so people don't get the wrong idea, my defense of Roy Moore in the face of the last smear was not an endorsement of Roy Moore. He's still an evangelocon, not the kind of Republican I tolerate well. I'm not even a Republican. It's like the Democrats. They're a business Democrat. Yeah, I don't really have a problem with that. Social justice warrior or fiscal liberal, yeah, I do have a problem with them. On the Republican side, if someone's like a Trumpite populist or just a general, they're a paleo, like a Rand Paul, yeah, that's okay with me. Somebody like a Roy Moore, it's like, no, I couldn't possibly. It's like if I had been in Alabama, who would I have voted for? I probably would have been a write-in vote at that point. I probably would have voted for myself. Because why would I want to vote for a crazy evangelical any more than for a liberal Democrat? It just wouldn't happen. And Doug Jones, mark my words, there's a 99% chance he serves a single term and then gets kicked out by the next Republican that comes along. So, I mean, you won't have to suffer, if you're in Alabama, you won't have to suffer through it for too long. And also, I think for the next couple of months or whatever, the dude who's currently in the Senate position will keep doing his job or something, I think McConnell said. I'm not sure how all of that works. It's Greek to me. It must be some weird Alabama thing. No, and trust me, one final aside, it was very, very funny to see Roy Moore try to ride a horse. It was really funny. It looked like a drunken cowboy. He looked like he was practicing for a role in Blazing Saddles 2. You know, he ate too many beans, he says, on the trail last night. So, what else? He's feeling a little bit uncomfortable at the moment. And it's clear he was rather uncomfortable. I'm not sure why he thought that was going to be a good photo op. That's about all. Peace out.